Ned Hawkins is the Director of Student Programs at the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. The topic of the Council's 2016 Summer Global Leadership Seminar for high school students is the migration crisis and the future for the European Union. In the weeks leading up to the seminar, Ned has studied all aspects of the crisis. Today, he's going to help us understand it better. Hi, Ned. Thanks for joining us. I thought a good place to start would be, what exactly is the migration crisis?
Yeah, great question. So really what we're talking about is the mass movement of people into Europe. And this situation is on such a scale. It's over 1 million migrants who have flowed into Europe. That's created really a situation that is the worst humanitarian crisis Europe has faced since the end of World War II. And really what the situation has entailed is the movement of migrants who are either fleeing persecution, war, or violence, or migrants who are also have chosen to go to Europe for economic reasons. And this has really challenged European governments and has also challenged a lot of the pan-European laws and systems in place to handle refugees.
So what are some of the potential challenges, risks, and rewards for migrants making the journey to Europe?
Yeah, so the journey itself is just tremendously risky. When you just hear the stories from the migrants themselves, this is a traumatic experience for all, if not, certainly for everyone. The risks are the journey itself. It's on foot. You're involved with transportation that is on a need basis. You might be on a train. You might be on foot for a long period of time, thousands of miles. It's unpredictable. You're also dealing with overcrowded refugee camps. There are criminal gangs who have taken advantage of the refugees. So, being robbed is definitely a big risk. And also the refugees or the migrants are actually very vulnerable. They have a goal in mind. They're being taken advantage of a lot of times by human smugglers and human traffickers. So those are it's just a very, very dangerous process. When you get to Europe itself, then the challenges aren't over. There's certainly significant challenges in regards to integrating into society. So if you do make it to Sweden or Germany, finding work, also just adjusting culturally to a whole new culture and a whole new setting, a whole new environment is a big challenge. Certainly, the reward would be, if you're fleeing violence or war, to be in a safe, stable place that the European member states are. That's certainly a reward. If you're an economic migrant, the European member states are, provide a high standard of living. So, having, that's certainly a reward for the journey.
So do you have an example of a real migrant story to help illustrate the experience?
I do, and there's so many horrible stories, and rightly so. I mean, this, as I mentioned, this is a journey that's full of a tremendous amount of risks and is traumatic for many. But to kind of focus in a different direction is the story of Mahmoud Bitar, who is a Syrian from Aleppo who made the journey to Sweden, and it took him over 3 years. And just to get into Greece, which would be the entry point into the European Union, it took him a tremendous amount of back and forth to Lebanon and Egypt, back to Lebanon, back to Egypt, to Turkey, and finally he made his way to Greece, and now is living in Sweden. And I think what's really interesting about his story is he has become kind of a star of social media and has used Facebook and various forms of social media to kind of show the integration processes process, and then the challenges of being, a refugee in Sweden and what it's like to integrate into Swedish society. He has, and he does this with a real sense of humor. So when he left Syria, like many Syrians, Sweden was kind of the land of milk and honey, and he thought, you'd have a new car, a new house. The reality isn't such, and definitely he kind of talks about it's even little things, the challenges of integrating, like when you live in Sweden and you have 20 hours of daylight, and during Ramadan you need to fast during the day, and then you get to eat at night, and 20 hours is not what he's accustomed to when he was living in Syria. So he does this with a real sense of humor and a young person who's really used social media to tell a story.
So can you help us better understand the response of the EU states to the crisis? Why are some welcoming while others are closing their borders?
It's a great question. So the European Union overall, the 28 member states, do have certain regulations in terms of handling migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. That's under the Dublin regulation. Although, through some leadership provided by Germany and some other member states, largely the response has been not a pan-European response, but more so of the 20 different member states responding to the crisis. And really, what's the difference between some states being welcoming, like Germany has been is a good example of a country who has been fairly welcoming to the refugees, and Sweden. And then you have certain states like Bulgaria or Hungary who have not been as enthusiastic as towards welcoming and integrating the refugees into to their countries. And I think a lot of that boils down to geography. Some countries are more on the front lines of the crisis. So certainly Bulgaria sharing a border with Turkey, Greece, obviously, Italy, Hungary. These are all countries that are, for lack of a better word, being overwhelmed by the crisis. And then, the second piece would be economics. For Bulgaria, for Hungary, their economic situation isn't the same as Turkey or France. These are countries that don't have the same amount of resources economically, and this presents a real big challenge for a country that might have difficulties, in economic terms. On the other hand, for a country like Germany or Sweden, this is an opportunity, perhaps economically. There are low birth rates in a lot of. Germany is a good example of having a low birth rate, and there's a need for migrants for economic purposes. So Germany has been very welcoming, and there's a lot of argument that this may down the road in the future be an economic benefit for a place like Germany or Sweden. And then you have, politics and history that factor in. Certain countries have, more political parties that might be anti-European or nationalist or xenophobic in a lot of cases. The history, of the 28 member states, the history can be quite different, and the experience. As I mentioned, history. Some countries have more of a history of international cooperation. Certainly the Nordic countries or Scandinavian countries have been, real big champions of international cooperation. So their attitude towards this is going to be slightly different than, some other countries that don't share the same history.
So to touch on that again, what is xenophobia? And do you think the crisis will transform these countries?
Yeah, so xenophobia is the fear or hatred of foreigners or foreign culture or foreign religion. Xenophobia, has, unfortunately been part of this crisis. In almost all of the EU member states, you are seeing, nationalistic populist parties that are kind of gaining momentum. These aren't parties that necessarily I would say are gonna take power. In some cases, that is a potential. But these parties, these aren't new either. These were parties that have been in existence for quite some time, and the situation certainly kind of fuels their message, unfortunately. How it would transform EU member states. I mean, it will certainly transform them in the short term politically. You're going to see a reaction based on people's fears in some cases. Public opinion is kind of split on how to deal with this crisis. So you're going to see this in the short term. My guess in the long term, that's a good question. It really depends on how the crisis pans out. This is kind of a moving target. It changes quite rapidly. And last year in 2015 during the summer, we had close to 1 million migrants. This year, we're starting to see some of the controls and some of the management of the situation be successful and be effective. I think this year so far we've only the numbers are kind of 250,000 is the number of migrants who have come to Europe. So that's slightly down than the situation that was presented the year before. One guaranteed long-term effect. A lot of European member states are going to be culturally diverse, and they're going to have religious diversity that they didn't have 10 years ago or even 2 years ago. A lot of refugees or migrants are going to choose to go back, but a lot are going to choose to stay, and that's going to change demographics in Europe.
How do you think many of these issues will be resolved in the future?
Yeah, so that's also that's $1 million question, hard question. As I mentioned, this is a moving target. Just to boil it down to some concepts. It's certainly going to take management of the crisis. I mean, in 2015, I don't think this should not have caught European governments by surprise, but I think they were a little more reactive to the issue. This is really going to take management on member states and the European Union's initiative to kind of manage the refugees and the migrants coming into Europe. It's also going to take cooperation. So it's going to take cooperation amongst the EU member states to kind of find a way to solve the issue. Certain countries are bearing the burden, and they're on the front lines. Certainly Greece, and Bulgaria, I mentioned Italy, and there are just ways to kind of goes back to the management piece, and it's going to take cooperation across all of the European Union's member states.
Thank you so much, Ned.
You're welcome.